The title of today's passage is called Living to Please the Lord. And I'm sorry for those of you who were in Mexico with me. This is a sermon I preached on the last day before we came back. But this title, Living to Please the Lord, I believe is something that we all strive for as a church. Amen? We all want to be a church that lives to please God in our everyday life. That's what we're aiming for. That's what we're striving for, to please the Lord in everything that we do. But how do we do that? I think many times when we look back at, our history, or even as I was doing ministry for the past, however many years, I've noticed that many times it's hard to live a life that's pleasing to the Lord. And one thing that I've noticed that the root issue is that many of us, we don't have a firm understanding of what our identity is, right? We don't have a firm idea of who we are. For example, many of our youth students, and I've been doing missions for the past 11 years, and I remember every year we go on these missions, kids encounter God in such a crazy way. And it's amazing because this past year, we had over 540 people from all over the United States come to Mexico and to serve together, to worship together. It was such a beautiful sight. I remember we built a new sanctuary that's bigger than, our old one that used to fit about 400 people, but now even this one it's getting a little packed, and there's so many things that God is doing. And just to be in that place, and just to be in that place of worship, it's so easy to worship God. What do I mean by that is when there's 539 other people worshiping God, it's so easy because you feel the presence of God. And in other words, when you're in that setting and you're in that atmosphere, because everybody is so consumed by God's love, it's so easy to identify with what's going on, right? Whenever we do Korean churches, we do the Chuyo 7, you know what I'm saying? We say Jesus 3 times, we start praying. When we do it in Mexico, it's crazy because literally the walls are shaking because of how loud it is. And when you're in that setting, when you're in that atmosphere, it's easy to identify with what's going on in that atmosphere. But many times when we come back from these missions, the hardest part is how to keep your identity. Because the world will always try to shift and change your identity. I remember for myself, growing up, I had a hard time knowing who I was, right? Instead of eating baby food and things like that growing up, the things that usually kids grow up eating, I grew up on things like chuk, you know what I'm saying? Like the Korean food. And instead of seeing sandwiches, I would see pop. Instead of seeing, Lunchables during my lunch, I would see fried mandu. And I remember growing up, it was so hard for me because I thought, man, who am I? At home, I'm a Korean. I go to school, and I'm supposed to be an American. Even when I'm at church, I'm a church person. When I go back to society, I'm a person of society. And from a young age, I struggled so much because I thought to myself, who am I? And wherever I went, again, whenever we go to a new place, don't we feel uncomfortable? Right? When we go to a new place where we don't know anybody, where we feel like nothing's familiar to us, we feel very uncomfortable because we don't feel at home. And for us to identify with that setting, with that place, with wherever we're going, we say to ourselves, well, I need to assimilate, or I need to be a part of the culture. And so I remember that's who I was. No matter where I went, I wanted to identify myself with wherever I was. So if I was at church, I wanted to be the perfect church kid. Why? Because that's how you become liked at church. If you go to school, what you do is, you don't bring Korean food because then you get ridiculed and you get mocked, but you bring the Lunchables, you bring the sandwiches, and you try to be like all the other kids. You try to be like everybody else. Same thing with at home, for parents, I pretend to study, right? I pretend to study because that's how my parents are going to love me. That's how they're going to approve of me. And so I would sit there for hours, pretending to study, but looking at my cell phone, playing games, whatever. Because at home, that's how I receive love, and that's how I find my identity. But if you keep doing that, what we find is we have an identity crisis. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we're doing. And when we're in these different environments, we adapt and we change. And that's the biggest problem that happens after we come back from missions. Is that, yes, we encounter God. And a part of it, yes, we do encounter a transformative God. And it's amazing. It's so sweet. It's so amazing. But the problem is when we leave that place, we lose our identity because no longer are we surrounded by 500 people worshiping God together. No longer are we in our comfort zones. No longer are we saying Chuyo 7 and crying out like crazy. No longer are we in that environment. We are all of a sudden in a place where the world says to change. The world says to stop praying. The world says to stop being passionate for God. The world says stop serving. The world says stop doing this, stop doing that, stop seeking a relationship with God. But God, He seeks for us to live our lives for Him. And so the number one thing to live for the Lord is to understand what our identity is. If we have been transformed by the gospel, if we have encountered God in our lives, no longer do we live by the world, but we now live for Christ. And for that reason, no longer do we live for worldly gain, but we now live for godly gain. And the thing is this, is I realize that even in our American society, even in our social groups, that it's amazing to see how much people really strive, how much people really do to really be a part of this culture. So for example, I'm a bash on, I'm going to make fun of youth kids a little bit today. I'm sorry. But there's this thing called Snapchat, okay? There's this thing called Snapchat, and it's something that everybody has on their cell phones, and all the kids have it nowadays. It's like the new Facebook, the new Instagram. But basically all it is that you take pictures, record videos, and you put it online. And people can only see it for like a short amount of time, about 1 to 15 seconds, depending on what you want to do. And you upload these things, and other people see it, and it goes away after a while. But the thing that's so smart that Snapchat did is it's not only social media, it's not just a way for people to talk to each other, but they also put in this kind of point system where people try to up their points, get these little trophies and badges and little things. And it's so ridiculous. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's just these little icons. Like these little pictures show up on the side of your phone and the side of these names. That's, it's like a fire or a smiley face or whatever. And the thing is, youth kids, they go crazy for these things. And it's very, 답답해 for me, because I'm thinking to myself, like, one of our students, she's not here right now, so thank God, but one of our students, she's so good at this thing called Snapchat. She has about 20 Snapchats that she has to open. And she's literally like a robot, She opens it, and then what they do, they take pictures of themselves, right? And usually, they take selfies and stuff like that, so they pose like, oh, they smile and whatever, and they take these pictures and move on, take these pictures. But she's so fast that she doesn't even have to think about what she's doing. She goes legit for 3 minutes. She's going through all these things. I'm thinking to myself, wow, you're so amazing at this thing called Snapchat. You're crazy. She's like a robot. And I'm thinking to myself, man, if you only spent that much effort and time just knowing God, man, how different would your life be? If you spent that much time doing this, but instead you did this, how amazing would the church be right now, amen? But that's what the world identifies. And I don't blame our students. I don't blame them for anything. Why? Because that's what the world says you have to do. They say you have to have a little icon next to the names. You have to respond to every picture. Same thing with, I'm sorry, I say this over and over, but it's just happening everywhere, right? Pokemon Go, okay? Some of the people are laughing because you guys know what it is, but nowadays you see people walking outside with their phones like this, right? Everywhere. What they're doing, they're catching Pokemon, okay? It's crazy because, our brother Frank, he showed me a video where he was at, what lake were you at? Lake Ontario? So he was somewhere, I can't hear him, but he was at some lake, and there were about 150, 200 people just there because of Pokemon. And they're all running together, and they're catching everything. I'm thinking to myself, man, this is getting so crazy. Pokemon Go has become such an integral part of our society. And the thing is, people do anything and everything to catch these Pokemon, to go to different gyms and take over. I know a lot of our parents are thinking, what the heck is he talking about right now? But basically, I think, Anggon said it best. Basically, kids are going outside and catching virtual 벌레 right now. It's like little bugs. They're just catching bugs. Okay, that's what it is. That's all that it is. But it's crazy because that's become such a big part of our society that everybody wants to do it. Everybody is doing it. And, I'm not saying that these things are necessarily bad, but at the same time, the world wants us to identify with these things. But how much longer will it last? Because even Snapchat, even Pokemon Go, they're new, they're relative, they're relevant. But at the same time, 5-10 years from now, I don't think it's going to be the most popular thing anymore. 5-10 years ago, it used to be Facebook or MySpace and things like that. Things come and go. What does that show us about human nature? Is that we get over things very quickly. As human beings, even biologically, we are designed not to love or commit to the things of this world for a long term. You look at cell phones, we get new cell phones every single year. Every single 6 months, a new cell phone comes out because we're so sick and tired of the old ones. So by human nature, we are not meant to be satisfied by the world. Isn't that crazy? That we are designed not to love the things of this world. But because we are addicted to these things temporarily, and we continue to temporarily get addicted to these things, our identity goes towards these things. But God is saying we don't want to have our identity in the temporal. We don't want to have our identity in the world, but we want to have our identity in Christ. But the thing is this, many times people are hesitant, people are hard to commit to Christ. Why? Because it's hard. Especially nowadays in our society, it's so hard to be a Christian. And I was reading this passage, and I couldn't pull it up for the first service. I'll read it for us this afternoon. It says in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, after Jesus talks about remaining in him, in verse 18, it says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it will love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." In other words, what Jesus is saying is, I know that it's hard to be a Christian. I know it's hard to hold on to the faith. I know it's hard to live for me, but that's normal. Why? Because when I came into it, no one liked me. When Jesus came into society, no one respected him. No one showed him love. No one elevated him. He said, the world hated me. But if you belong to the world, it will love you as its own. So the question is this, are you willing to lay down the love that the world has for you to receive the love of Christ? Are you willing to lay down the temporal pleasures in life so that we could gain this relationship with God? Because at the end of the day, this passage is talking about Jesus' disciples. We're looking for people to follow Jesus Christ, not just encounter God, not just meet God and go away, but Jesus, he's looking to make disciples. And we see that all throughout the Gospels. Jesus is not just in the business of healing. He's not just in the business of miracles, signs, and wonders. He's in the business of making disciples. But many times we're so hesitant to do that. I think to a passage where 10 lepers came to Jesus, and nine of the 10 they got healed, and they just went back to society. But Jesus was so frustrated because only one came back. He said, "I'm not looking to heal just for healing's sake. I'm looking to heal so that people will come back to me, so that people will follow me, so that people will live a life pleasing to me." What does that mean? Is God desires for us to be disciples. God desires for us to follow him in everything that we do. It's not just about the encounter, and that's what God is looking for. God's not looking for 520 people saying Chuyo Sebon. God is looking for people after Mexico going into society and living for Christ. Even if it means being hated, even if it means being ridiculed and mocked and made fun of for Jesus, to have that, because that is how you identify with God. So the first point that I wanted to make today is this, is to know who you are. As Christians, we're not meant to be liked by society. As Christians, we're not meant to be liked by the world. As Christians, we're meant to live for God and God alone. So that's number one. And I know this is kind of hard, kind of connecting it to the idea of faith, but it all relates. Because how can we live lives of faith if we don't know who we are? How can we live lives of faith if we don't identify with God? That's like saying a blind person describing things that he doesn't even know. How can we say that's possible? But the thing with God is once you encounter God, we have a decision to identify ourselves with God. Then we can go forth and live by faith. I want to share a story. This is a story that I love to share. But in the book of Luke chapter 8, there's this story. And I just want to break it down for us from beginning to the end. So if you could turn to your Bibles to the book of Luke, we're going to Luke chapter 8, verse 40. Let's all turn there together. Actually, we're going to start from verse 43. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet in the presence of all the people. She told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Basically, this is what the story is. You have this woman who had been bleeding, who had been subject to this physical pain for 12 years. In biblical times, if you are sick or if you have any problems with your body, then you are considered an outcast. You're considered a sinner. And so this woman, for 12 years, that was her social status. She was a sinner. She probably did something wrong. Her family probably did something wrong. She was an outcast from society. And basically, in different gospels, in the book of Mark, it says that she went to other people, to other doctors, to other people, and tried to be healed from her disease. She tried everything that she could, and she squandered, she used all of her money. And she came to a point where she was no longer able to live anymore based on what she had, and she was about to give up. But she hears about a man named Jesus that has been doing these signs, these miracles, and these wonders. And I think to myself, many of us, aren't we in that same position? When we live in this world, yes, we live for the world. Yes, we live for success. Yes, we live for money. We live for pleasure. We live for these things. But doesn't it get frustrating sometimes when even when you get the things that you want, it's not what you thought it was? Even if you gain richly or in earthly treasures, you don't receive the satisfaction that you think you're going to get. And that's what this woman is dealing with at this moment. She went to everybody that she could, trying to fix her social status of being a sinner and a sick person, but nobody could fix her, nobody could heal her. And so her identity was firm in those things. But what happens when she hears about this Jesus is that so many people are crowding around you. Maybe about hundreds of people are crowding around Jesus. And she says, "You know what? I want to be healed so badly," to the point where she says, "I'm going to go fight through this crowd and touch Jesus. I don't have to talk to him. I don't have to have a conversation with him. I don't need to ask him to pray for me. All that he has to do is I have to touch his cloak, and I believe that I'll be healed." And could you imagine that type of act that she had to commit? Many of us, we're so unable, we're so unwilling to seek God because we think that we should live comfortably. But keep in mind, if she wanted to be just satisfied with where she was at, she wouldn't have done anything. Many times, the Christian church is not willing to fight for their blessings because the sacrifice is too much. But the thing is this, at this moment, this woman, she understood that for her to receive her healing, she had to fight for her blessing. She had to fight for her healing. It's not just that she was going to sit there and wait and wait and wait, and then God's going to come to her, but she chose to go to God. And even through all the pain and all the struggle of fighting through these people, she said, "Get out of my way. I need Jesus. I need to be healed." But many of us, we're not willing to go through that. So she fights through. And finally, she touches the hem of his cloak, and she was healed. Maybe before she was just trying to fulfill her earthly, identity, no longer being a sinner, no longer being sick. But if that were the case, and if that was the end means, if that was the goal, then after she was healed, she should have left. And that's the part that I always find myself astonished by, is that she received her healing. After 12 years of suffering, she got what she wanted. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she go away? Because even though the earth and the world and what she understood good life to be, she encountered something that was so much more amazing than anything that she's ever received in her life. Even though her social status just changed that moment, not only did she receive her healing, but she encountered Jesus. So she stays. Seeing that she could not go unnoticed. Well, first of all, Jesus says, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Knowing that she could not go unnoticed, she came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had instantly been healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Many times we encounter God. Like I said, it's so easy for the 500 to encounter and meet God. But God is looking for people who will go out in faith in response to the encounter and to do something that's uncomfortable maybe, to do something that's scary, to do something that you don't want to do sometimes, just so God could be glorified. And that's what this woman did. It says very clearly she came trembling at his feet. She was so scared because she knew that if anybody recognized her just from 5-10 minutes ago, if anybody knew who she was, if she told all the people that she had been bleeding, they have every right to kill her. But for some reason, even though she was scared, even though she was timid, even though she was afraid, she came to Jesus because there was something more valuable to her at that moment. And she said, and it says very clearly, she told why she had touched him. She told them everything. She said, I have been bleeding for 12 years. I was a sinner. I was sick. I shouldn't deserve all this. But when I touched Jesus, all of a sudden I received this healing. She says that before all these people without thinking about her death, without thinking about the persecution. And it says something so beautiful here that I believe ties everything together. Jesus says, daughter, your faith has healed you. He doesn't say woman, he doesn't say sinner, he doesn't say lay, whatever. He says daughter. And isn't that amazing that he calls her by that name, a daughter? And that's what I'm talking about. When we choose to identify with God, when we encounter the Lord, when we choose to live by faith, no longer are we unadopted, no longer are we orphans, but we are adopted by God, and he calls us his sons and his daughters. And that's so amazing. Why? Because in this passage, even though she was scared, even though she was shy, after she said these things, Jesus said, wow, I look at you as my child. I look at you as somebody that I love and someone that I endear and someone that I will take care of because you are my beloved. And then in response to that, it's so beautiful. It says, your faith has healed you. Sometimes we think faith is this abstract object where we say, oh, have more faith, have more faith, have more faith. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, whatever. But the thing is this, when he says faith, I think back to all that she did. All that she did was fight through this crowd, touch Jesus, tell people what had happened. It was so simple. And that's what Jesus describes as faith. When we push and we strive to encounter God, and after we encounter God, to go forth and tell people of the transformation that we've experienced, God says, wow, your faith can move mountains. Wow, your faith is pleasing to me. And so in this moment, that's what Jesus is most pleased by, that she decided to do something. But my question is this, are we willing to do anything in faith, brothers and sisters? Many of us, we don't. Many of us, we still struggle with this idea of identity. Let me tell you something about identity. Even as Christians, we have a hard time with our identity. I've been, serving as a pastor for about 4 years now at different churches and different capacities. And when I met God, it was something where God transformed me from the inside out. But even from then, it was hard. It was hard to find my identity in Christ. In ministry, I was 19 years old when I started. I would look up to these great pastors and these leaders, and I would say, wow, I wish I could be like them one day. Wow, I wish I could preach a great sermon like that one day. Wow, I wish that I could make people cry like that. I wish I could, lead people into ministry like that. I wish that I could do so many things just like those people. And it was hard. Why? Because I would go to places like Mexico and Panama and Bolivia with these other chundusayans and these other pastors, and I would think to myself, well, will I ever be there? Will I ever be as amazing as these people are? That was the insecurity that I had. And for me, just kind of my character and just the sinful nature of myself, I want to make a confession this afternoon. For me, I tried to find my identity in ministry, and what better identity could I have in ministry than to be in the position that I'm in right now? 2-3 months ago when I was told that I would have to lead the church, yes, it was scary, yes, it was hard, yes, the responsibilities grew, but there was a part of me, the sinful nature part of me, that said, wow, finally I get to be in a position that I wanted to be in. Maybe now my identity will be secured. Now, when I talk to other people, they'll see my status, they'll see my title, they'll see my responsibility, and they'll say, wow, this is a man of God. But let me tell you something, in these past 2 months, with all the responsibility, my image of what it was supposed to be, None of it was meaningful. If anything, I felt so distant from God. That's a confession I want to make this afternoon. Because I thought to myself, I need to please people, I need to make people happy or whatever, but the thing is I'm not here to make people happy. The Korean church, not just our church, but the Korean church has this mentality where we revere pastors, and rightfully so. I believe that God calls the anointed, and we should respect the anointed. But I think sometimes the biggest problems that us pastors that we have is that we let it get to our heads. That the position of pastor, of 전도사님, whatever, that is more important than our relationship with God. Sometimes we think that the responsibilities that we have is more important than just being in reverence and in awe of Him every single day. And I remember I got so frustrated with myself because I thought I got everything that I've been looking for, everything that I wanted, but why do I feel so unhappy? I started praying to God. I said, God, why do I feel this way? And I realized I let ministry become my identity. I let this title of pastor become my identity, and that's not what God wants. I went into ministry not because I thought I was going to be a pastor one day. I didn't go into ministry and serve because I thought I would be at this church one day. I went into ministry because I loved God and I wanted to understand the love of God more and more every single day. And so I started praying a very dangerous prayer. I said, God, if my preaching gets in the way of my intimacy with you, God, take away my preaching. God, if my worship, if me leading worship in front of people gets in the way of my personal devotion to you, God, take away my worship. I said, God, if missions become something that I glorify more than I glorify you, God, then take away missions. I don't care about any of those things. God, I just want to please you. God, I just want to see you move. That's the thing is, even in ministry, I identified myself so much with the things that I had to do that I didn't identify myself with Christ anymore. Maybe some of us feel that way. Some of us who have been serving the church for so long, what's more important? Serving the ministry, serving the church, or your relationship with God? Because we could be excellent in everything that we do. We can make the best chubos in the world. We could be the most welcoming committee in the world. We can do this and that, be the best praising. It doesn't matter if we don't love God in the process. If we don't identify ourselves with God. So what do we do in response to that? What do we do in light of that? It's very simple. It's do what that woman did and do something about it. Do something about the position that we're in. Number one, no longer identify yourself with other things, but identify yourself with Christ in the same manner that this woman did, in that she did everything possible to encounter God. She fought through these people. Fight for your blessing. Fight to be blessed. Why? Because it's hard, and especially in this society, as we talked about in the book of John, it's hard to follow Jesus. But if we choose to follow Jesus, if we choose to glorify Him in our daily walk with Him, God is so pleased by that. And secondly, and I'm going to end with this, it says very simply, and without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. Brothers and sisters, are we earnestly seeking Christ in our lives? Are we earnestly seeking God? Because I think many of us, we seek more of the things of the world, myself included. But God, He's designed for us to live by faith. It's a very simple message today, living to please the Lord. Living to please the world is not seeking approval of man. Even the Apostle Paul, it says in the book of Galatians, am I now trying to please man, or am I trying to please God? Or am I now trying to still please man? If I were trying to still please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul says very plainly in his letters, I'm not here to make people happy. I'm not here to be the most liked or the most loved or the most respected person in the world. Paul was persecuted, he was beaten, he was flogged, he was ridiculed for his faith. He says, not about men's approval. He also says in the book of Philippians, I believe, he says that for me, Understand this teaching. He wrote this in Timothy. He said to Timothy, understand and abide by this. Understand this teaching. He says that Christ came into the world for sinners, of whom I'm the worst. Paul identified himself as the worst person alive. But God used him to do amazing things. Why? Because Paul had faith. Paul wasn't necessarily the most gifted or the most talented or whatever it may be, but Paul had faith. That even as he was in prison with Silas, when everyone said, your ministry's over, he just began to worship and sing praises to God. Even when he was being persecuted left and right, whatever it may be, he just continued to bust out all these crazy things for the Lord. He said, I'm not doing it for men. I'm not doing it for their approval. I'm not doing it just for the punigi to be right. I'm doing it for Jesus. Brothers and sisters, this afternoon, as you go off into your homes, into your society, whatever it may be, your workplaces, the question that I want to pose today, are you living to please the Lord? Are you living as an identified son and daughter of Christ? Are you going forth and doing things of faith? And I want to end with this. Yesterday, I was so happy because, I took some of our students that went to missions with me, and we went out for lunch to Buffalo Wild Wings. Right? We went to lunch, and we're going into the entrance. We just parked in the parking lot, and this man, he comes up. He says, sir, do you have any money? I need to eat, please. I'm hungry, and I need to eat. And at the time, I didn't have much cash on me, and so I said, you know what? I don't have money, but can I buy you a meal? Because that's what I always do. I try to buy a meal and try to get to know the person. And he says, right now, I'm not hungry. I'm just trying to survive for today. And then he said, who are we? What are you guys doing? And I said, we are from a church. I'm their pastor. We just came back from missions, things like that. And he said, wow, that's so amazing. Could you guys pray for me before you guys eat today? I was so shocked by that. I didn't ask him if I could pray for him, but he came up to us and said, would you please pray for me before you eat your food today? And I said, of course we'll pray for you. Can we also pray for you right now? He said, of course. And I laid my hands on him. I just started praying to God. I just started dedicating to the Lord. And I'm not saying this to boast or brag or anything like that, but I'm saying it because God has given me an opportunity to live by faith. God always gives us opportunities to live by faith. It's a question of whether or not you're willing to fight for his blessing. It's a question of whether or not you're willing to do what God asks us to do. I remember as I was praying for him, I could tell in my spirit as I was watching, he was tearing up. Why? Because he just wanted to receive the love of Christ too. We look at society, we look at the homeless and say all they want is money for drinking, all they want is money for drugs. But this man says, hey, even if you can't give me money, I want your blessing. And that's what Peter did in the book of Acts. He said, hey, these beggars and these hungry come to me. Although I cannot give you food or money, I can give you something that will last forever. And that's what it means to live a life of faith. We're not living for the temporal. We're not living for the Snapchat and the Pokemon Go's or the jobs or the money or the title or the position. We're not living for those things, but we're living for something eternal, which is this, is that God desires to encounter his people and to be in relationship with him forevermore. And God is pleased when we partner with him. God is pleased when we follow him. God is pleased when we're ridiculed and mocked for our faith, but God is also pleased when we act in faith. So brothers and sisters, as we go off to wherever we need to go, live lives of faith. Identify yourself with Christ. And let's give the world something that will last forever. Can we all close our eyes in prayer, please?